Our chair for this panel today is Professor C. Raja Mohan. Professor C. Raja Mohan serves as the chair of the Editorial Advisory Board for India's World magazine. He is widely regarded as one of India's foremost scholars on foreign policy. A visiting professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. Now, our panelists for today, Ambassador Dr. Philipp Ackermann is the German ambassador to India. He joined the Foreign Service in 1993 after completing a doctorate in art history. He has served in Morocco, at the United Nations in New York, in Afghanistan, India, and the United States. He has held some senior roles in the German Foreign Office in Berlin, including the Director General for Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. Ambassador Dr. Mohan Kumar is the professor and dean at Jindal Global University. He served as India's ambassador to France and Bahrain. He led the World Trade Organization talks, and he has authored 2 books, Negotiation Dynamics of the World Trade Organization and India's Moment. Ms. Suhasini Haidar is the diplomatic editor at The Hindu, where she covers Indian foreign policy and hosts the weekly show Worldview with Suhasini Haidar. She has nearly 3 decades of experience, including roles as foreign affairs editor and anchor at the CNN IBN, and as a correspondent for CNN International. Professor Gulshan Sachdeva is the Jean Monnet Chair at Jawaharlal Nehru University and Chief Coordinator of Dakshin at RIS. He edits the Europe-Asia Connectivity, co-edits the Asia-Europe Journal. He held the ICCR chair at the University of Leuven and served as a visiting faculty at 9 European universities. He holds a PhD in economics from the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Thank you, panelists, for joining us today. Over to you, Professor Raja Mohan.
Thank you. Thank you, Maruk. Let me join the India's World team led by Professor Happy Jacob in welcoming all of you this morning to the launch of this 5th issue of India's World. So before we go any further, let me do a plug. Please buy it, read it, do subscribe. It's a really an exciting venture, unique, I think, in the Indian magazine and media scene at this point. Now, I think I was in Europe last few days, thanks to our German political foundation, the Frederick Ebert Stiftung. I think there's no escaping the dramatic moment in Europe. It's really talking to people in Brussels as well as in Berlin. It's really a defining moment has arrived in Europe. I think Europe is actually in a way back at the center of the global conflict. For a long time, Asia was kind of taken up by its own rhetoric about Indo-Pacific centrality. Asia is where things are going to happen. But as we noticed in the last 3 years, it's back in Europe. The main conflict in the world is taking place in Europe. And it's also taking place in Europe in the same area where the 3 great world wars took place in the past. Back to whether it was the Cold War, whether it was the Second World War, whether it was the First World War. The Central European fracture line in the middle of Europe that is today in deep contestation between competing powers. And I think what happens there, I mean, as we've seen in the last 100 odd years, what happened in the center of Europe affected everyone. Today too, I think what happens in Europe is going to affect all of us. And this time it's not just a European war, because you have China with a very big role as a key partner of Russia in the war. We've seen North Korean troops on the Russian side. We've seen South Korean weapons on the with Polish and other side. We've also seen Iranian drones, the Turkish drones make an effect in this war. So this is not just a European conflict, but this is really a truly global conflict. And given the scale and the stakes that are involved, the outcomes here are really truly going to be consequential for the entire world. In that sense, what happens here, the outcome of this war will lay out a new framework, much as the Yalta system did in 1945, or the Treaty of Versailles did in 1919, or the previous rounds of European diplomacy. So I think what's happening is really critical. Second, I think the Europeans themselves see this as a moment of rupture. I've just learned a German word which is called Epochenbruch. Epochenbruch, yeah. It is not easy word. Epochenbruch is about a rupture, that we are moving from one epoch to another epoch in geopolitics and international relations, and for Europe in particular, I think. Many of its assumptions of where it was going, those have been shattered. And I think Europe's relationships today with the US, with China, with Russia, and its larger position in the international system are all at stake. So I think we see a new language. Those of you who might have heard von der Leyen's speech, September 7th or 17th, just before that, I mean, Europeans also have this thing called the State of the Union speech, where actually the language, they talk about autonomy, of independence, and of seeking to act in their own interests, and that Europe would no longer be a plaything for others, and that they have agency of their own. The language, I think, in many ways sounds very similar to India's in terms of strategic autonomy, etc. But the parallels are also quite clear. In a way, it's often been said Europe gave its, depended on Russia for energy, depended on America for security, and China for markets. I think all three today is in a bit of a stress. Somewhat like India. India depends on Russia for weapons, China for all the manufactured inputs. And on the tech side, we are completely tied to the Americans. So I think, given what is happening, I think there's going to be, both of us, Europe and India, need to reconfigure our own places in the world. And in that process, I think one of the main things we do in this issue is really why India and Europe should work together, both to expand their own agency and role in the international system. Here, I think, just to give one example, Americans are now targeting the H-1B. I mean, unlike many Indians, I'm not outraged. Look, visa is a sovereign right. So for many of my Indian friends, I mean, we seem to be entitled that every Indian engineer has a right to go to the United States. There's no such thing. Visa is a sovereign right, and India exercises it very brutally. When those of you know how hard it is to get an Indian visa, we should appreciate this is a domestic market situation. That is, if the market demanded a certain type of labor, you got it from outside. And if it didn't suit some of the people, it's a political question within the US. For us to treat as something specially directed at us, I think, is a mistake. But the interesting thing is, if US does not want to take it, there are other people who want to take Indian tech profiles, tech personnel. We have Ackermann's tweet, I don't know how many of you seen on X, Indian techies are welcome to Germany. Germany has a stable immigration policy. So looking to bring, and in fact the last 2 years, maybe you can tell us a little bit about that in our talk. So we already seeing, we have migration and mobility agreements between India and Austria, Italy probably. So we're doing a lot of things today, but this time, unlike in the US case, it has to be more regulated, more carefully managed, because immigration is a toxic issue, as much in Europe as it is in the US. But I think, so it's not at the end of the road. I mean, it's a reconfiguration of the markets, of talent flows, all that will be sorted out. So I would say, really, it's an exciting time, I think, for India and Europe. It's a fruit of, I think, last 10 years of intensified diplomatic level engagement. I wish we had actually, on the academic side, think tank side, we had done enough to do as much to really study Europe and Europe's history, its politics, and its changing imperatives at this point of time. So we have 4 very good panelists. I'm going to start with Ambassador Ackermann. So they're all going to speak for about 10 minutes each. Wait, you want it longer? No. Short. Okay, we can take more rounds then, maybe if you want to make a short intervention. Then Ambassador Mohan Kumar will have to leave a bit early, so we'll take some questions for him. But I think there is enough time for short speeches, some questions.
Thank you very much, Raja, and I think you have made a very, very convincing point here. when I listen to your words, that Europe again comes in the center of the world history after 2 world wars and a Cold War, it's a little depressing, actually. I wish it was different. I think there is a big difference, though, between the last 100 years and now, is that Europe now is united from Estonia to Portugal. So there is a clear, united and unified Europe, and I think the EU plays an enormously important role in it. That tries to handle all the problems you have very, very convincingly laid out. We should not forget that Europe is now undergoing unheard of provocations right now. The Russian military is flying into airspace, Estonian airspace drones to Poland. We have seen what happens in Denmark, although it's, I think, not entirely clear. There are clear indications that also comes from Russia. So all of a sudden we are exposed to a situation that leads us to discuss measures and ideas on how Europe has to defend itself much better and also much more powerful in front of a country that has no shame to provoke in the most blatant terms. And I think, and Hervé said it in his speech, this is something that when we become closer in our partnership, we expect the Indian side at least to understand, that this is something that is of the greatest importance to us. Geography plays a role, there is no doubt. It is clear that Russia for us is much more a threat than for countries in this area, but I think when we want to grow closer, you have to understand that this is something that bothers us and concerns us big time. So understanding doesn't mean that you have to align yourself with European policies. I think that is understood, but you have to develop a certain sensitivity, I think, in this matter. So that's a point I'd like to make at the beginning, that if we want to grow closer, you have to understand the political sensitivities. That is also, of course, true the other way around. And I feel that once Pahalgam happened and Sindoor happened, you have seen European reactions that were maybe much more wisely drafted than before. So there is more sort of understanding from the European side when it comes to the Indian situation. But I think that's the way we should work on that. That's one point. You mentioned the H1B problematic. I completely agree with you. It's the sovereignty of it's a sovereign right of every country. I would disagree on the fact that it is market driven in America. It's a pure political move, and I think it's not very smart. That's my personal opinion. But I think that in the years to come, Western countries, European countries, but also Australia and Japan and Korea will compete for skilled labor because they all have the same problem, that the demography is moving in a direction that can't be good for our population. So I think it is very wise to start, drafting your migration laws in a way that you open up for skilled and labor. Now that doesn't mean that migration is completely uncontested. It is not. It is very contested in my country and many other countries too. But the governments have to make people understand that you have legal fair migration and you have illegal unfair migration, and that's something which is a huge task. But I can tell you that in Germany at least, Indian migrants are welcoming, contrary to other nationalities. We have a very good experience with Indians, so we feel that India is a very valuable contribution to our economy. I think our countries will be, all our countries, not only Germany, but will be more and more Indian in the years to come, because you'll have more Indians coming to Europe. We have now 60,000 Indian students in Germany, and the number grew by 20% last year. So you will expect that this will grow, and German universities are very happy with Indian students, so they will also.
Cheaper as well.
It's cheaper than the US, much cheaper, because it's. But in Europe, in many European countries, education is a public good. I see Eliška here. In the Czech Republic, very good old universities where you can study for no tuition fee, and that's something that must be attractive for many Indians. And as more and more courses are taught in English, all across the board. So you'll see that there is a sort of a growing readiness to accept Indian students. I want to, Hervé mentioned it in the speech, there's one thing that for us is, I think, of very, very big importance that's coming to a conclusion with the FTA. FTA will be a game changer for our economies. I think when you consider an FTA in which form ever it will come, and I'm very confident that we'll get to a conclusion by the end of the year, it will be for European business in many, many ways sort of a starting point for more investment in India, because it is just cheaper to bring stuff in. And I think we feel that in spite of the last round, as you said, was maybe not as much a breakthrough as we would have hoped, but we see there is also an engagement and dedication from the Indian side to come to a conclusion. So I think FTA for us is maybe the most palpable outcome of these Indo-European relations that we want to promote and foster. And then my last point, maybe before I stop, is security. Now this is maybe a little more complicated. I mean, the EU is very complicated. I think if everybody tells us how complicated India is, but frankly, I think competing EU is still a little more ahead than India, because before you understand all these structures and the way of how the EU works, the word joint communication as such is already quite an enigma, because you don't. Why is joint? Yeah, because it's the Commission and the Council and the High Representative. So basically, you have to learn about the EU, and we don't make our lives easier with all this. But I think EU has to be understood in a way that also, when it comes to security, that lies not with Brussels but with the member states. So I think there are more and more joint military exercises. There are more joint visits, also port calls, with different navies from different European countries. But the security aspect, which is, I think, an important aspect in the relationship, will maybe be a little more bilateral than Europeanized. But I think when you think of Europe, you have to calculate this bilateral level always in, because it's part of the European effort, and we Germans understand it as part of the European effort. So I think you'll have maybe more visibility of Europeans in the Indo-Pacific. We Germans expect a new frigate early next year. And we'll have participation in military exercises. When we taught Tarang Chakti, the famous Air Force exercise was with Germany, France, Spain, and also the UK. They joined. So that's something which we'll see in the months and years to come. Having said that, what is now happening in Europe, and you referred to it, is of course our first attention. Is our own border, and I think this border is under attack right now, and we have to find ways and means to defend it meaningfully. But I think I stop here because I've covered a couple of things.
Ambassador Mohan Kumar, I'm just going by the sequence.
So thank you very much, and I want to thank the organizers for this opportunity. I am in the middle of distinguished ambassadors. I am an extinguished ambassador trying to be a distinguished scholar. So I'm only trying. I'm still trying. So I'll just make a few propositions for India-EU relationship. Anything much more meaningful can't be done in 10 minutes. So I'll just make these. Some of them are provocative. I'm looking at Nandan as I say that, so you can easily imagine what I'm going to say. But let me begin by saying that in my scheme of things, India and the EU should unconditionally facilitate the rise of each other, both geopolitically and geo-economically. We are not there yet, but it is my view that it is in the mutual interest of both India and EU to facilitate the rise. In terms of rise, obviously what I mean is the EU should enable India's geo-economic rise, because I think geopolitically we probably punch a little bit above our weight. But for the EU, I think what the grand bargain can be that while EU facilitates our rise, and this will mean they pay a price vis-a-vis China and so on, and if there are questions, I'm happy to address those. I think with regard to India doing something for EU, I think what we can try and do is co-production and co-designing and on defense, really. We should do that because as the unreliability of other partners becomes more and more evident, and again, we can discuss it if you like, main suppliers, I think EU can really provide this ballast for our security and defense relationship. So that is the unconditional rise of each other that I talk about. Secondly, this is obvious. I think we are the ultimate mutual hedge to each other, frankly. Because in the world in which India finds itself, in the world in which EU now finds itself, including the transatlantic partnership, I think we need that hedge. And I believe that India and the EU can be the perfect hedge to each other. On the Ukraine issue, I think India has to kind of have a tough conversation with Russia because our Prime Minister has said on more than one occasion that this is not the era of war. And when it comes from the top person in India, I'm assuming that there is a lot of thinking behind it and why he has said it more than once. I think we need to have this conversation with Russia as to why they think it is the era of war. And they continue. That is one. But on the other hand, and I will also say this for the EU, the legitimate security interests of Russia have to be appreciated, no matter what your views are on Russia's invasion and the drone attacks that are going on, the loss of lives, all that is not fine. And I condemn it as much as anybody else. But I think there is if you step back and you look at the issue dispassionately, I think you'll realize the legitimate security interests of Russia have to be taken into account one way or the other. Otherwise, you're going to have a broken security architecture in Europe. And this is not of interest at all to India, since I've already said we would like Europe to be our partner and to be this hedge, if you like, and also the unconditional rise of Europe, in my view, is in India's interest. But all of this can't happen if you have a security architecture which is broken, and it is broken today. So I think that is my comment on Ukraine. On FTA, my favorite line is, don't leave it to the trade warriors on both sides. They're as bad as the wolf warriors of a country which shall remain unnamed. I mean, really, there's no different, frankly. So you allow them to negotiate, but at some point, political leaders have to step in. Otherwise, I have been a trade negotiator myself, so I recognize one when I see it. Please give me this much of respect. And I think they're equally cussed. Both of them deserve each other. And they will kill themselves to death. And it is not in anybody's interest, frankly. So I think at some point, political leadership has to step in. I worry a little bit about the bandwidth of India, because we are also doing this with the United States. We are going to do it with other countries. I'm told Oman, whatever. But you need a negotiating bandwidth for all that. And I know the bandwidth that we have, and that's not sufficient. So that worries me just a little bit. But I think innovative ways can be found, including hiring me. I'm kidding. I'm quite happy. I'm quite happy being outside the government, but I think some such thing has to be done, frankly. You have expertise outside the government. You can't be so close that you keep saying one person and he will be the chief negotiator. That's not the way forward, I think. On multilateralism, and I think the joint communication, Ambassador Hervé Delphin was talking about it. I think one thing India has to do now is, there is a thing, we like acronyms, as you know. We love acronyms, right? But the Europeans love acronyms which are more complicated. So even the name of the diplomatic service is some 6 letters, I can't imagine. European Action Service, whatever. So I think MPIA is the European acronym for the WTO dispute settlement arbitration mechanism that the Europeans, I think India should look at it very carefully with a view to joining it, frankly. We have stayed out of it. And it is increasingly likely that US will not come anywhere near the WTO. But I don't see why India should not join forces with EU in trying to support the multilateral trading system at a time when you have the US obviously being disruptive. I want to remind everybody that no matter what the US does, their share of the global import market is 13%. So 87% is still open for India to do what they want. And therefore, it is in India's, EU's interest to actually make sure the multilateral trading system works. I would say that Indo-Pacific is an area where I think we have to assume that Quad will continue, but the intensity of the Quad and what it is capable of doing, there's a bit of a question mark. But regardless, I think India, EU working together in the Indo-Pacific is a very, very good idea. It's also a good idea because both of us, in the heart of our hearts, don't want to be confrontational vis-a-vis China at this stage. I think both EU and India, obviously I'm not saying we have the same position. We have a border and we have 50,000 soldiers, staring at each other in eyeball to eyeball confrontation. But having said that, I still think for various reasons that I cannot go into now, I think both of us don't want to take on China frontally. And therefore, this might just suit both of us. On what India and EU can do with regard to markets such as Africa and so on, I think triangular cooperation, not trilateral, triangular cooperation, it's a term in development economics, I'm sure all of you know. I think that has not been sufficiently explored by India and EU, and I think we should try and do that. Can India, EU become rule makers, at least in the area of tech, AI, quantum? I have been somewhat, Hervé, you will forgive me for saying this, I've been somewhat disappointed by TTC. It took a long time for the TTC to meet. Anything to rejuvenate this Trade and Technology Council that India and EU have, it's vital, absolutely vital. You ask any Indian, he will tell you, we want this relationship with EU because in climate, you can get the latest technology. EU, the thing about EU is they're not in your face like other partners, but they have some of the best technology available. And we don't access enough of that. So I think the TTC needs to be rejuvenated and ways have to be found for it to meet every other month. With critical security minerals at stake, technology at stake, I don't think you can afford to meet once a year in Brussels or Delhi. The last point I want to make is that, and that's really a political point, I actually, in all the years of my watching the EU, and that started somewhere around, I would say, 2007, so really for the last 15 years, I have never seen the Commission so powerful and so predominant. Now, this could be attributed to the main states of Europe having their own distractions and internal problems. My favorite country in the world, France, has got its own series of... I never served in Germany, Ambassador. It's your fault. No, sorry. No, I spent a long time in France. But I think they have their own distractions. Germany is fine, but they too, I think, are in a bit of a... not distraction, but I think they have their own issues. So if the Franco-German motor is not what it is, then, and you leave actors like Orban and others who are, I think, doing what they are doing, the Commission has, I think, to the credit of von der Leyen, and I don't want to introduce this as a dispute between Hervé and the German ambassador or the French ambassador, but I think the Commission has quickly grabbed this vacuum, if you like, which is a good thing from India's perspective, because India has traditionally only dealt bilaterally with France, Germany, Italy, and Spain, and we have said, okay, that's enough. Why bother? The old Kissinger thing, give me a number of the European Commission and so on. But I think the time has come now when you have to take, I think the College of Commissioners who made a trip to India, for me, that's a turning point, actually, in terms of the bilateral relationship. And I think it's a sign that India has to take the Commission seriously. And I think a defense, again, to think that we had the first foreign and security policy dialogue in June 2025 after so many years, this is ridiculous. I mean, but is probably just as well, because Commission is coming into its own, and we can try to figure out something in the area of security defense. I would want a full-fledged defense agreement, actually, if that is possible. We are beginning with security and information exchange, which is good, but I think eventually we need a defense framework which is solid between the two entities, EU and India. Raja, thank you so much.
Thanks. Suhasini, you want to?
Thank you, and thanks so much for having me on this discussion. Everything that one hears about the European Union and India would make it a no-brainer that EU and India should actually have great relations. They're almost described sometimes to me as twins. The idea that they're both these essentially federal structures that are diverse, multi-ethnic, all essentially democratic in their way of thinking, pluralistic, and abiding by rules-based order and looking at a multilateral world order. The other parts of this are equally compelling. The idea that India and Europe, shorthand for the European Union, which is not exactly the same thing, but that India and Europe have a historical culture of knowing each other. As an Indian, this is not the relationship with the US, which does seem a lot of the times a little one-sided in terms of what you know. Indians know everything about America. America, I'm not sure, know that much about. Americans don't know that much about India. This is not the relationship between India and Russia, which has, at least traditionally and at least in the last decades, essentially existed at a government-to-government level and not so much as the people-to-people level. This is not the India-China understanding of each other, separated by Himalayas and in more recent times by a lot of mistrust and conflict. This is a relationship between people who have an easy memory of visiting each other. There is no European museum you will go to where you will not find some memory of India, some travels to India. India, of course, and some of it, what I'm saying is controversial simply because it is a colonial past of Europe that is entrenched in India, not just the UK, but also, the Portuguese, the French, the Spanish as well. But this is an intensely historical relationship between each other in terms of seeing each other as the old world. We know each other. Even without the FTA between them, if we come to the modern day, you're looking at $200 billion trade in goods, $100 billion in services, strategic partnerships with, since he started with France, I'd say with Germany, with France, with Italy now much more, and even Spain. And the fact that they are both beneficiaries in a sense of that rules-based order, if such a thing right now exists, I don't know, but there's always been a sense that the European Union with, if I may say, a security shortfall, this idea that the European Union did not focus as much on security, and India with its economic shortfall, were both beneficiaries of a rules-based order that worked in the world. Given all of that, where is the problem? What is the problem? Why are we looking past each other on most big debates? Why is it that it seems like we've got all the elements of the great relationship, but they don't add up as a whole that is larger, that gives you a sense of community between the EU and India in a way we do see with a lot of other relationships that both the European Union have and India has. And here, honestly, I don't need to go past Ambassador Delphin's fabulous speech, which is exactly what relationships between friends should be. A culture of speaking to each other freely and honestly and addressing not just those things that go well, but all the others. It is here that I want to make the point that we look past each other in times of need. That's the important thing. In times of need. Because of basic structural differences in our view, not just of ourselves, but of where we see the other. So, for example, we always speak about the fact that we are bound by strategic autonomy. Both of us have a really strong version of feeling of strategic autonomy. But it's a different understanding. The Indian understanding of strategic autonomy is one of non-interference in what I do. It is much more about taking decisions according to national interests. The European version of strategic autonomy is actually much more about adhering to common norms, having conventions that we all agree on and following the rules in that sense. It comes perhaps, this difference comes perhaps from the idea that Europe has been the historical traditional rule maker of the world. India still feels very cut out of the whole rule making process. Of course, you're absolutely right. In the future, when it comes to technology, we are both neophytes in a sense, and we have to fight for that place there. The second is that geography matters. Famous, I keep referring to this Napoleon comment. I never know whether actually any of these historical figures say these very important things or they're just attributed to them, but the idea that show me a country's geography, I'll tell you its history. If you look at India in a map on its own and just keep going, countries, landlocked countries or countries bound by its continental reality, up and up, you will get to Moscow without finding a single country in the Western sphere of influence. Whether it is Pakistan, the Stans, China, Mongolia, all the way past Georgia, you will not find a single country there that is part of the Western sphere or Western understanding. On the other hand, for Europe, the obvious challenge is all the way to Moscow, is that they are part of that Western sphere. So when we say that, in a sense, we have all these similarities, we're coming to it from very different areas. It's what explains whereas Russia is right at Europe's door and is, of course, arguably a European country. For India, Russia is at the periphery of its security challenges. In fact, it has been a friend. It has been a trusted partner. I know these are difficult words, but those have to be understood. In a sense, Europe built a regional project. Europe wants to be seen as one regional, unit of regional consequence. India, at least in the current dispensation, wants to be seen outside of its regional context. India wants to dismiss the idea that it belongs to South Asia. These are basic structural mindset differences between them. I agree with the ambassador when he says we need to show a deliverable global project, a deliverable project where India and the EU work together, whether it's on development, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific. Of course, India's engagement with the NATO didn't quite take off as some had thought it might. But even something like IMEC comes from structural, and here I think both EU and India seem to shy away from the truth. EU and India talk up IMEC all the time. I don't hear the same talking up from the actual points that connect the two of them. It is no longer a project that the UAE, Saudi Arabia and Jordan are acclaiming in quite the same way. And it's very simply because of Israel's war on Gaza and the idea that for the foreseeable future, I really am trying to look really far ahead, you are not going to see a secure IMEC going through Israel and going through Haifa port in particular. Europe, in fact, has been more open-minded. We have 3 different ports of IMEC that might work in Europe. But until you're looking at a different alignment for IMEC in West Asia, you're looking at an inherently security unstable place. And again, these are ideas that we have to talk about even if they are difficult. Ambassador referred to the Russia question. This is a very basic divergence. India has not, I'm stunned by the response I saw when there was the political committee that came to Delhi a few weeks ago, and the response to India taking part in Zapad. It took many of us in India a little by surprise simply because we didn't even think it was a big deal. India and Russia are constantly in military exercises with each other. It's a daily occurrence. It doesn't make the front page. And here was all of Europe, suddenly well versed with this idea of Zapad. And I can write for you the number of different exercises we have taken part in all these 3 years, without necessarily understanding why there was this complete explosion in response. The idea that India has not yet, and Ambassador Mohan Kumar can use that phrase, this era is not of war, to suggest that India has in some way been uncomfortable with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The truth is, the government of India has never called it an invasion. The truth is, the government of India has never once criticized in explicit terms Russia's actions in Ukraine. There were 25 different resolutions at the UN, in the IAEA, at UNESCO, on the Human Rights Council, things for humanitarian corridors, things for nuclear safety that India abstained on. If you don't engage with this reality, you can convince yourself that somewhere there along the horizon there is a meeting of minds on this issue. I would beg to differ. So when you say stop seeing India, India should stop seeing Europe through Russia's eyes, I don't think India sees Europe through Russia's eyes. India sees its relations with Russia completely separate from its relationship with Europe. So again, as I said, there is this, we all understand the same English or understand the same words and syntax, but we are taking different things away from them. Finally, of course, there is the very prickly issue of human rights. And it is true that in recent years, we no longer hear that as a real problem. Has Europe stopped caring about human rights? Because we don't see any joint statements with any European countries that any longer discuss Kashmir or the rights of minorities in India or press freedom, it doesn't mean that Europe has stopped caring about these. And in India, there is a basic understanding that these will pop up just when it hurts the most. I think it is absolutely true that India also questions the European double standards. And although India too has been very muted on the humanitarian aspect of Gaza, it has been extremely interesting to kind of compare the obvious pain and outrage that any European feels when they come to speak about what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And you compare it with the actions of Europe over the last few years when it comes to Gaza. Turning a blind eye to starvation, turning a blind eye to what UN experts are now calling genocide, and continuing to send weaponry there. That is something that Indians, I don't know about the government, but Indians certainly see the double standard on. Climate, again, is a place where India and Europe come from different places. I think there's a lot of complementarity. There's an idea that India has everything to benefit from the way Europe has been able to harness renewable energy and to actually make changes in its citizenry so that anyone going to Europe today is deeply impressed with the way everybody in each of these EU countries has adapted to using less fossil fuels. And I think India has a lot to learn from that. I think when it comes to the FTA, I know it's been very long, and it is it's seen so far as a hope that it'll be completed. But I think what's more important from what we have seen in the last few months particularly, but also in the last few years on the FTA, is the most important thing between EU and India. That after all these years of looking past each other, we are actually now beginning to speak a language that both of us understand. Whether or not that FTA is signed, I think the compromises that both sides have made in the last few months particularly tell us that Europe and India actually do have a better common future ahead.
Thanks. Gulshan, yeah. You want to say something on the connectivity as well?
Sorry?
On the connectivity issue?
Okay.
What were you saying?
Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Raja, and congratulations for this special issue on Europe. And I'm really delighted from the Center for European Studies that there is more focus on Europe and on EU. So this is really very good because people are taking Europe seriously. We have been taking at the European Studies Europe very seriously for many, many decades. But so I'll just make a couple of points, broad points, rather than actually just saying what is happening today, because things have been happening and will continue to happen between India and Europe. The first point is that, you're cultivating Europe. In fact, if you look at what Dr. Jaishankar mentioned a couple of years back in his book, Cultivating Europe, Engaging US, Managing China, Reassuring Russia. I think the way things have happened in the last few years, he has to write another book, and I'm sure he will write again. One is, we don't need to cultivate Europe, frankly speaking. Because for the last 20 years, particularly since Strategic Partnership 2004, and many things have been said, what has happened since then, I think India has cultivated Europe quite enough. Europe has cultivated India enough, and the recent strategy paper is another evidence of this. So the time is really to deliver something and engage with each other seriously. So when we are saying actually engaging with the US, we really need to engage with the Europe, and we may need to perhaps cultivate US now, because many others are cultivating US, particularly our neighbors. And also on managing China. Geopolitically, yes, managing China is a very important challenge for everyone. But also, we also need to engage China in a very different manner, because if you look at and the same is also true actually to some extent also for Europe, for our manufacturing, for our exports, for our technology and everything else, China can provide something very, very important things for India's modernization. And reassuring Russia, I think we don't need to reassure. For the last 3 years, enough reassurance has been given to Russia. The only thing is that in the changed circumstances, how do really we again get Russia, because for our energy security, for our infrastructure, defense modernization, etc. So I think all those things need to be, and yesterday Dr. Jaishankar was saying re-engineering something. I think he also has to re-engineer many things, what he wrote just a couple of years back. Now, one thing is quite clear to me, at least for many years, this is what I have been writing. Europe, despite all the challenges, problems, which it has many, and of course the broader decline of the West in the long run, at least till 2047, your ambitions of Viksit Bharat, Europe will continue to be very, very important for India, particularly for trade, investment, technology. And that has been the case for India for centuries. If you look at pre-colonial period, post-colonial period, 47 onwards, and even post-Cold War period, and even now, and in next 20, 25 years, I think apart from, of course, the period when we had, the colonial period, that's a different kind of engagement with Europe, but both Europe and India benefit each other. They benefited when there were more integration, with the economies of Europe and India, and that's really the case again for the next 25 years. So then what we really need to do, there are a couple of things there. Even if you look at the 5 pillars and Excellency has mentioned about the new strategy. But again, the core of this, even a new strategy, is core of economics. And this is where the competencies of the European Union are. And if you're talking about India and EU particularly, we have to get something out of this FTA. Because if we are not able to, we keep talking about many things. And one thing which is real deliverable is your FTA. And if you are not able to do that, other things will just fade. And then also linking with that your TTC, your Trade Technology Council, Connectivity Partnership, and of course IMEC, and many things are lined up. So what we really, the starting point of that would be really getting FTA out of way. And it's not easy. And Ambassador mentioned, we have been talking since 2007. And obviously in 2013, when the negotiations were frozen, what the European Union official position was that ambitions are different. Obviously ambitions were different, and I think even today ambitions are different. But still, even despite having different ambitions, we have to find certain ways, and of course have to be compromises. And many of those compromises, my feeling is, have to be done by the European side. India on certain issues is not going to make any compromise. But luckily now we have the India FTA, FTA with the partnership agreement with EFTA countries and also with the UK. So there is a certain template. Certain things can be made. But if you're not able to do it, I think then, all this talk of engaging and cultivating will not really work. Then another point about this connectivity you said, mentioning, Suhasini, you mentioned about IMEC. I've been following all these connectivity things for decades now. These are the things, these are long-term projects. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen. There'll be ups and downs. We have seen in the International North-South Trade Corridor. We have seen with many others. But good thing about all these, major, initiatives of connectivities, that it continue to give a very positive twist to your narrative. So if we continue to talk about IMEC and positively talking about this will be a continued positive twist between India and the European Union. Now how it will happen, it will take, what shape it will take, we don't know. Certain portions, the India-UAE portion is already working. Similarly, even if the International North-South Trade Corridor, now the Russian-Iranian corridor is working, others are not. So things will keep happening. We have to keep that narrative alive. Many things will happen out of this. And the point you also made, Excellency, about if we really want to engage with each other seriously, then we also in India and also in Europe perhaps need to invest much more in knowing each other, which we haven't really done. And all our UGC centers have been closed down on the area study centers. In fact, the European Union still kind of helping in some extent, through it all, the Erasmus and the Yomane, etc., all kind of things. But all our, the ICCR chairs, they are more or less closed down. And even if they are there in Sanskrit and Hindi and something, not really knowing what contemporary India is, which all the European students, European, university think that they would like to know. So we really need to invest much more in this one. And just one or two more points. One point about, the building new world order. And within that, how do we really can work together, which, Happy Mohan, you mentioned about this. Last week I was in Madrid and we had a serious discussion about this, particularly Europe engaging Global South and what India can really do with this. I think there is a problem here. The problem is, India, of course, we talk about strategic autonomy, and I think to a large extent we do exercise that strategic autonomy the way our foreign policy is conducted, because this is what is the DNA within the Indian foreign policy. But in Europe, I think you talk quite a lot about strategic autonomy now, and I'm not talking about the French idea, but even broadly within Europe as well. But when it comes to real strategic autonomy, the first thing we have seen when you want multilateralism, and the core of that is also WTO. When there was the first attack on WTO or the global trading system by Trump administration, both UK and the European Union was the first to go and negotiate and get the deal with them. Still China is dealing in a very different manner because of its own economic strength. Brazil is just defying. India is, where we are now. So it means, Europe should have actually taken a lead in this. When there was a major attack in building new something, instead of just going to the, to the United States, Europe with its own economic strength could have taken a lead. Perhaps, a country like India could have worked with you and many others. And I think many countries in the global south could have done that. That opportunity has been lost. So it means when you talk many things, but actually when it comes to building, well, and the last point about Russia, since both of you have talked about this, we have been working with the EU and the European partners, despite very different perceptions about what is happening in Ukraine for the last couple of years and since 2014. That also shows that there are so many convergences despite our different perceptions about Ukraine war. But I think the only thing which we need to be very careful, you both have mentioned about how Russia is viewed in India, which is actually, this is what exactly the situation is. Now, and in fact, I was reading, article by Ambassador Sanjay Verma, in your thing only, how he was tackling this issue with European diplomats on the Russia one. So, we can discuss about this behind the scene with all your diplomats, but, when you come openly, like I've seen a couple of statements from, Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kalas, that can actually derail many of other things which perhaps are going to happen in the next couple of months. So we have to be very, very careful about when we are talking about Russia. We can have very serious, frank discussions behind the scene, but openly, in fact, many things that President Trump had said, that's what it has led to where we are, the India-US relations. So that's the only point. Thank you.
Thanks, Gulshan. I'm sure it's always ask other people to take the leadership. I think we didn't take the leadership either. China is not taking the leadership. So I think, look, given the scale of the attack on WTO that was mounted by Trump, I don't think anyone was in a position to take leadership. So people had to negotiate. Each one had such a huge trade file with the Americans. That's how the world works. The idea that someone would carry jihad and line up everyone and take on the evil Trump. Unfortunately, international relations doesn't work like that. We've done this leadership business, and I really like Dan Stopping, who said, never take leadership, look after yourself, which is where the world finally works. I thought what I'll do is I'll just ask each one of them one question, and then we can go to the audience. Maybe to start with you, Gulshan, I think we'll come this way. In a sense, since you follow the transport corridors, what is the state of the debate? Is 23 September we announced the IMEC. I know Turks are opposed to it. Egyptians have had some problems. In the Middle East, what is the state of play in terms of where the connectivity issue is?
I don't think Egyptians are against it. I think that's not really the Egyptian position is.
But they don't want to undercut Suez, that's what
Yeah, the question is, this is a good alternative. It's a good, I would say, blueprint. Obviously, the name is India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. Obviously, it was invented somewhere else, not really in India, because otherwise it would have been India, West Asia, Europe Economic Corridor. So to some extent, whether Americans have still interest in the, IMEC, I'm not very sure. But definitely there's much more interest in Europe now. Ultimately, the way I think the trade is going to grow, you need, and there are difficulties, there are choke points, there are other geopolitical problems. So everybody is looking for more and more alternatives. So it's not either or kind of thing. So it will be, so how do you really develop this? So I think at the moment what India is doing, you are just focusing on the India-UAE corridor. That corridor, because there are plenty of volumes are there, trade volumes, and that's not really linked with Middle East other troubles there and what's going to happen further. So you're focusing on that particular one, and a lot of work has been done, digitization and how ports connected with each other, etc. So I think bits, and this is the way it's going to work, and the narrative will continue. And I think Europe will also start building its own certain things. And now different countries are, coming. It's not just only Greece, Italy, France, many others are also going to talk about this. And that's the way I think it's. That's why I said it's a long game. It's a good idea. Continue to promote this. Yeah. That's all.
Mohan, coming to you. When you mentioned Russia's legitimate interest. I think that's a position we took in 2014. India took. What would that be? What would be the Russian legitimate interest at this point of time? Sorry, I was not.
So, look, you have to leave value judgment on one side, because if you allow on this issue. If you allow your own predilection, intellectual predilection, ideological affinity and value judgment, then it becomes very messy. I think, frankly, that any NATO presence in Ukraine obviously is out. Now, you can interpret this differently, but I think Russia has a problem. They have a problem in terms of their legitimate security interests. Whether it's legitimate or also not legitimate, you can quarrel about it. But I think that is one. Neutrality of Ukraine is one. I would also say, for example, that what kind of eventual solution are we talking about? What do you do with the 4 oblasts? That is also an issue which is also linked to the security of Russia, because they will say there are lots of Russian-speaking people there and so on. And finally, I would say that recognition of Russia as an important security partner in Europe, that itself is in doubt now. You can't just wish away a country like that and say that you're going to build your own security architecture. So, and now this is not to say that pressure should not be put on Russia. As it is, it is quite astounding for me. And again, please don't take this the wrong way. I love Europe and a lot of things common between Europe and India. But very conveniently, you are now saying you will use the assets that you have confiscated from Russia, and you will use it to fund Ukraine. So how do you expect a person in Russia to see this? Please tell me. You want me to jump with joy and say that, no, this is a damn good thing. So I think everything really has to come into the mix. But like I said, I've stuck my neck out enough. I don't think India has had as tough a conversation with Russia as it should have. I genuinely believe we should have had a very tough conversation. I'm not privy, I'm not part of government, obviously. But you have to take that thinking forward, not the era of war. But because to me, it's like they're thumbing the nose at us. And you are saying we love you, legitimate, long-standing defense partner and the rest of it, but they're thumbing the nose. That's how I see it. It's my PM, damn it. He is the one who's saying no, era of war. I respect that. And I expect very long-standing friends to respect that. So I am a firm believer that we have not done enough on that front. But then for Europe to keep saying, we will do this as long as it takes, and at the same time you say we depend on the US, you know exactly where the US is standing now. Where is it heading? Is no one interested in the loss of lives on both sides? I think you have to put an end to it somewhere. I know it is distasteful because Europeans will now tell me, listen, aren't you rewarding Russia? And the last point, Raja, I'm sticking my neck out, but that's the whole purpose of meetings like this, I think. If you're going to give the party line, you might as well, go to the website and read whatever you have to read. But this idea that Russia will not stop at Ukraine, I don't know. Is there any evidence of that? So I think I would like to know. And don't take me 100 years ago. Huh? I'm looking at present situation. Thank you.
Suhasini, I wanted to ask you a question. One of the big issues that has been in play last few months is the India's purchase of Russian oil. So you see where the debate is going, and now the Europeans themselves are saying they don't want to impose more sanctions on India. So where do you think is actually the state of the oil purchase from Russia is? Is it subject to change? Because you cover the thing on a daily basis. So what is the politics or diplomacy of it at this point?
I think the politics, diplomacy, everything comes down to 2 words, and that is zero principles on both sides, right? India, from the beginning, in February 2022, the government said very clearly, we don't even take 1% of our oil from Russia today. Look at Europe. Europe takes how much oil from Russia. At that time, the pipeline was still running.
We went from 2 to 40.
Exactly. We went from 2 to 40. And so there was no principle involved. Nobody went back and questioned our external affairs minister and said, hey, what happened? You said you only take 1%, so don't come after me, and now you're taking up to 40%. Second, even if India gives up every drop of Russian oil today, and there is every indication that the government is moving in a direction which seems to suggest it is reducing its Russian oil, not because of its great relationship with the European Union, but because of its possible pain points that the US has presented. Even that will not be a matter of principle. It'll be a matter of exigency. So to make a virtue out of it, and however much Europe might welcome such a move, it's not a virtuous move either. I do think that in the last few months, what we have seen is very clear. The European specific targeting of Naira Energy, which is made up 50% of Rosneft ownership and a consortium that may have some more Russian components to it, has been pivotal in stopping one large importer because insurance, shipping has all become difficult for them. I think on the other hand, Indian PSUs have already started to cut down when it comes to Russian oil. But I do take Professor Sachdeva's point carefully. I don't agree simply because I do think that we are a democracy. And I do think European countries are democracies. And therefore, each one of our leaders should actually say very honestly to their people what they feel. Diplomatically or otherwise, how do you get away from the idea that no European leader can really condone what they see as India's laundromat or oil washing of Russian oil and reselling it as refined products? But I do think that what will happen is we will reduce, we will actually have some kind of understanding between us on it, other discounts that will be given to us from the Western world as a result of it, but it will not be a victory of principle.
There's always power and more than principles. I mean,
pain and pressure.
But I want to come to you, Philip. Look, I think for the Indian audience, I think whether we agree with the Europeans or not, we got to understand Europe is at war. You can fudge around it, say, right, wrong. When you're in war, I mean, we got to understand that sentiment in Europe. 3 years of one of the most brutal wars we've seen, and the prospect for its expansion. That's also reality. So I think these are realities on the ground. Just as we feel, what happened after Pahalgam, the whole of India, nationalist mourned. You see, I mean, you got to understand something similar on the other side. So the merits of the case, the diplomatic issues, principles, history, negotiation, all that is fine. But I think it is important, I think, for the Indians to understand the Russia question, how Europe sees Russia, which is really, we've, I think, largely taken a one-sided approach to this. As Suhasini pointed out, I mean, we're not willing to criticize Russia for any of this. And it's not shocking. We didn't criticize them in 1956. We didn't criticize them in 1968. We didn't criticize them in 79 when they invaded Afghanistan. We didn't criticize them in 2014 when they invaded Crimea. So it doesn't tell you about the principle. What it tells you is, because Russians were friends, we're not going to criticize them in public. I mean, that's all it tells you. But that would change someday, possibly, given the relative weight of Russia in your overall situation changes. But that's, again, it's a question of politics, rather than is some kind of a high principle. But now, having said that, Philip, the question is, I mean, on the Russia question, there was a point at which, what Mohan was saying earlier. See, Macron and Chancellor Scholz, they tried to convince, they in fact explicitly articulated, someday we have to have a European security architecture in which Russia has a role. Now, given we've gone a long way from there, what are the kind of ideas that Europe has, maybe even in Germany? And of course, I know that Europe is divided too. I mean, not every, in fact, there are so-called peace parties, both on the left and the right. Russia has a lot of influence with many of these parties. So where do you see this whole debate going? Maybe you can feel free to add whatever.
Yeah, I think that, when they say in diplomacy, never waste a crisis, this is maybe the moment where also the security in Europe gets closer together and tries to find a common voice. We have these German-Polish brigade, there's a German-French brigade, there's a German-Dutch brigade where nations come together, and they're not only Germans and Dutch, there's also other NATO partners being part of this common approach, and therefore I think this is the time where we have to sit down and try to also figure out how together we can also beef up our equipment, with common projects, be that planes or tanks or there is a history of common projects and in Europe, and I think we should evolve that and develop that history. But let me go back to Russia, because I think it's a very important point. Every country has the right to design their relations with their old friends, but I think to say that with the argument that there are legitimate security interests, it's not fair. it's not a convincing argument. You should not mess up imperial sense of entitlement with security interests. What we see in Ukraine is that the president of Russia thinks Ukraine should not be a country. That's what we see. And we see, and we have the three ambassadors of the Baltic states sitting in this room, we see that in a region, countries that are very close to Russia, the Russian president has no shame really to show its power and violate the sovereignty of these countries constantly. What is that for a signal? What is this for a sign? So what we see is there is an imperial outreach by the Russian president. Ukraine was, before the war, never meant to be a member of NATO. Never. There was no country was really, no influential country was pushing for it. That has changed, I would say. But I don't see there is a security interest in Ukraine feeling that NATO come to Ukraine whenever or the big countries also saying that Ukraine will not be member of NATO. We have now 2 new members of the NATO through this war who have been neutral for a long, long time, Sweden and Finland. So basically that calculation did not end well. And we have a confrontation with, I think, where a legitimate security interest, I can't see that the instrument very convincing. I think you are completely right, Raja. Europe is in a pre-war situation. In Ukraine there is big war, but also in the rest of Europe. And we see Russia as an existential threat to the European territorial integrity. And that has to be taken into consideration by the Indian side. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to follow Europe 100%. I don't say that. But I think it would be better to say our bilateral relations with Russia have a long tradition, and therefore we continue to have good relations with them, and not blame Europeans for violating legitimate security interests, which I really can't see. And may I say one word to Suhasini, because I think last year I would have bought your Israel argument, but that's not true anymore. Because you say double standards. But when you see what happened in Europe on Israel right now, there was the conference in New York where many European countries recognized Palestine as a state. We have proposals from the Commission on the table sanctioning Israeli politicians, which has never been the case before. My country, being basically the most hesitant when it comes to Israel, has stopped delivering arms to the Israel army when it comes to the Gaza war. So basically, I think actually the European Union, in all frankness, is much more outspoken on this issue than the Indian government.
That's another story. Someday we'll get there. Another issue maybe, the issue on the Middle East when we can. So let me now turn to the floor. If you can ask very short questions. Ambassador Mohan Kumar has to leave shortly. So if any one of you has any specific questions to him, we'll start with that.
To leave without the questions on Russia being
Yeah, Dr. Jacob. Yeah.
I have very, very quick question. I'll be very quick with it. I think when it comes to the Russia question, there is the moral argument and there is the argument about interests. On the moral argument, clearly, if the argument is that, listen, you must condemn the Russian invasion because it's an immoral, it's an illegal war against Ukraine, I get it, but I think that has to be universally applied, especially in the case of Gaza. I think that needs to be spoken more and more about the question of Gaza. On the question of interest, now, if you say, listen, we are friends, India and European Union are friends, and therefore we must support each other when there is a crisis or a question of national security. We understand that Europe is feeling insecure from Russia because the Russians are doing what they're doing on the borders of Russia. But just like you have your wars, we have our wars too. So when we fight our wars, how many of the European countries support us? We just had a conflict with Pakistan. We have had issues with China. So I think it goes both ways. So both the moral argument and the material national interest argument works both ways. I just wanted to put that on to you.
Sorry, Happy Man. It's not a moral argument. It's an argument about threat. It's an argument about you are threatened by a country that is in your neighborhood. It's the moral argument, put it aside, say it's a threat argument. And that means that when an Indian contingent goes and does a military exercise in an exercise that is called West, Zapat, it's called West, means that you are basically feeding into this threat. If Indian government buys a ship from a Russian shipyard in Kaliningrad, and this ship does with the Russian and the Indians a little tour in the Baltic Sea, that is not some nice excursion anymore. It is always some, now it has always some military implication. So it's not about moral, it's about feeling a threat and palpable threat from this country. So basically what I want is, the argument, I've heard it 10 times or 100 times the argument, but you are not condemning Pakistan enough, which is maybe the case. We have tried to do that in Pahalgam, and after that we have tried to do it. But at the end of the day, what we expect from India, if I may say so in blunt terms, is understanding how Europeans feel in the current situation. And you see everyday violations of our sovereignty. Now, that's not a moral point, sorry. It's a threat.
Okay, Mohan, you want to comment on this? And on the, I'm sure as a diplomat you would constantly deal with values and principles, reality and politics, interests.
No, look, I'm trying to look ahead. There is this polemics over this, and I have no view on it. By diplomat, you can call me what you like, but I have no view on it. And you can go round and round and say who supported me, I am facing problems and so on. But to me, it is important that at least some people in Europe, look at the medium to long term and start thinking about a European security architecture in which Russia has some role. That's all I'm saying. To not do that and to keep saying, no, this is the issue and we want to, that doesn't help, frankly. It doesn't help at all. It also doesn't help if you go back to the who cast the original stone. Then read John Mearsheimer for amusement. He will tell you who cast the original stone. Of course. Because you will go 10 years, I'll go 25 years back and quote. So that doesn't help. So that is the way I look at it, Raja. But I'm not an expert by any means in this area. But to me, it seems that it's very important for India that Europe is stable. And the only way I see Europe being stable is to have a security architecture at some point in which Russia has a role. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, please, first I want questions to Mohan Kumar. So is anything specific to Mohan Kumar? Yeah, please, keep it brief and continue. I'll take both of them, Mohan, and then you can...
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the interesting conversation. I'm Rahul. I'm the Managing Director at Rice and House. Ambassador Kumar, you've been speaking about an European security architecture with Russia as a role. Definitely, Europe is going through a security glow-up. Do you think that this security architecture with Russia in it has to be independent of an US involvement like we are seeing now? Do you see an US space for this renewed security architecture?
Got it. Yeah, please. Yeah.
I'll answer both.
Yeah, since all of you spoke about technology,
Please.
to Ambassador Mohan, so how do we operationalize that technology transfer since we are dealing with dual-use dilemmas in high tech, especially semiconductor, quantum, and artificial intelligence? How do we operationalize that trust factor? And since we name India-America Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies to trust, but all that trust is waning nowadays. So how do we operationalize that in terms of technology?
Thanks.
Thank you.
I'll take a third one from here, all to Mohan Kumar, and after that you're free to...
Thank you. I appreciate everybody on the back
to drive all the way
allowing me to go. Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Rahul. Quick question. Just as you say that, just as India expects, for the sake of future of India-EU relations, EU to factor in Russia into a European architecture, I'm going to flip that to Ambassador Mohan Kumar for the sake of this argument. What if the EU said, why don't you have Pakistan in your security architecture? Why aren't you talking to them for the last few years? Why aren't you shaking hands with their cricket team, for example, before a match and after a match? So what's your take on that equation?
So the short answer to your question is you don't compare apples and oranges.
Just wait. There's Ambassador Lithuania. Yeah, I think after this, there's a lot.
Well, it's very fascinating. Thank you very much for very frank deliberations. My only wish would have been that we would phrase discussion on legitimate security interests of Europe, but not Russia, because this is like EU-India discussion. So I think the starting point is to actually understand the legitimate security concerns of Europe, of European Union, of so-called Eastern flank, which I represent, and yes, I have very much, rejoiced at hearing that, the call is to understand how we think. Not me as ambassador. I'm paid to say certain things, but about the people who feel like, because you said that it's nonsense to think that Russia would go beyond Ukraine. Thanks God, it's been stopped. It's hopelessly stuck in Ukraine. But in 2022, it's absolutely, we have been living with the fear of bombs. And I had to explain my crying children what we're going to do. It's a very, very different setup from what, like, you elaborate on the high podium from, looking at the world map. I can only say that my country exists because we are NATO. Just because we joined, I'm here and not in the labor camp somewhere in Russia, because we would have been the first ones. So I think to twist that thinking about how the people, the voters, think in Europe, because it's a democracy, and the leader would be standing and saying things, they would be coming from the people, from the horror stories we hear from hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian refugees, and so on. So I very much congratulate that, discussion, but definitely agree about more, we need to understand each other's thinking more. And I take the point also on India-Pakistan relationship. I agree, we have to speak much more. In fact, very recently, we have been told not to interfere in that. It's a very strictly bilateral things. So, probably you can open that discussion of where this comes in and comes out.
Thank you. Mohan, I think.
So very briefly, Rahul, I think that is apples and oranges. Different regions, I can't answer it any better than that. In terms of what you said, Ambassador, you are part of NATO. Your security interest is taken care of, for God's sake. What is Article 5 all about? So that is the point. If you have a problem with that, that is because of whatever else you are having with US. So my view is your security interest is taken care of. And I don't think anybody has a problem with NATO being there. I only said they have a problem with NATO being in Ukraine, but not in your country. So that's at least my response.
Huge problem.
Huge problem. Huge problem with what?
That they are in the Baltic states have become member of NATO. The Russians have a huge problem.
Let them have a huge problem. But your security interest is taken care of. That's okay with me. They can have a problem with everything. But when they have a problem with Ukraine, I believe they have a legitimate security interest. You'll have to grant me that. If you don't, you don't. But I think that is my view, at least. On technology, I think EU and India can do a better job in terms of trust, I believe. Because as entities, as partners, I think there is a better comfort factor. So I think actually that I would look to EU for a greater degree of transfer of technology to India. What was your point? I'm now forgotten.
Do you see American involvement in this new European?
Yes. Now, this is for EU to decide. They have a transatlantic partnership, and it is very closely linked to their own security. But that is something that I would leave them to decide. But frankly, if the EU is thinking of an independent strategic role for itself, in terms of compact defense and so on, I think it is good if EU can actually devise a security architecture all by itself. That's what it should be doing. It is their continent, and they should have the principal voice. They can rely on the US for whatever, at least in the medium term. It is my sense that the EU is aiming for independence in strategy, security, and defense, at least in the medium to long term. So I'm also talking about medium to long term, by the way, when I talk of architecture.
Thanks much, Mohan. Feel free to stay on whenever you want. I think we'll take a few more questions for the panel as a whole. Please.
Yes, thank you, Ambassador of Estonia. And I tried to be fast before Ambassador Mohan goes as well, just to put the things into the perspective also for the Indian audience a little bit. So a little bit more than a week ago, we had 3 Russian fighter jets in our airspace for 12 minutes. So
shoot them down. I have no problem saying that. You're governed by NATO. Do whatever you have to do to protect
yes,
your
Turkey
that
did
doesn't
that.
bother me at all.
We are currently not doing that. But just as a comparison for you, it would be the same as very close to New Delhi, there would be Chinese, I'm not saying Pakistani, but Chinese fighter jets. They are not willing to leave. We had 3 Finnish fighter jets following them. Then in addition, Italian, 3 fighter jets joined them, no reaction whatsoever. 3 fighter jets don't get lost. 19 drones in Polish airspace do not get lost. It's a clear provocation. But yeah,
question-
it was
the question-
rather a comment or explanation. Just regarding the frozen assets, I just wanted to mention as well that you say what the Russians are thinking about that. What do the Ukrainians think about that? About the country which is destroyed, which they have to reconstruct, which they didn't do anything to cause this kind of situation. That's the way we think. But I do say as well that we do have to have this kind of open exchanges as we have today. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, here. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ashkazhigov, Ambassador of the Czech Republic. I would like I have no question, just to remind that there was already a big wish and try to elaborate Russia into the European security structure. The Russian ambassador was part of the NATO round of ambassadors, invited for many meetings, and there was a big wish that Russia will be our good and reliable neighbor. But it had finished in 2014 when Crimea was taken. So this was a try, there was this kind of process to have Russia as part of the European security structure. Thank you.
Yeah, there's some more. Yes, please. Yeah, please. And pass it on afterwards.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Simran, and
Keep it brief, no?
my question is very brief. It is slightly digressing from the traditional security concerns, but it is about the India and EU partnership in terms of technology and even the fair trade agreement. How do India and EU think of deepening cooperation to lead global agendas like sustainability concerns in AI development and AI use?
Okay, yeah, got it. Yeah, please.
Perhaps it is a bit of a cumbersome question, but considering that I come from Europe, so I'm Italian, and I've seen how the war has impacted on the economy, especially for the European side in this talk, whether you see perhaps in the very long future reconsidering even nuclear deterrence, because, you know, European Union is not a geopolitical subject. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take, yeah, Anirudh. So please note the points on that.
So I was thinking, I think Mohan, Raja, that it seems like that the conversation today has been about EU-India security dilemmas and not so much about navigating the overall ties. So my question is actually on the latter, which is, if you were to pick, all the panelists were to pick one thing instead of five that EU and India Europe and India need to figure out, what's that one area? Economic, security, tech, migration, talent. What is that one area? And the reason that you would say has to be the priority in all our discussions, because otherwise I worry that the relationship will get very much like what we've seen the discussion be today about all the differences and the things that we can't overcome. And the reason I ask that, and the other piece of my question is, if this conversation was happening between EU and China 20, 30 years ago, would this conversation have been as wide-ranging, or would it have been very focused? And I'm leading to the point that I think industry ties, economic ties here are probably the thing to focus on, and not everything else that we've been focusing on, where we know that there might not be any solution.
Was there back? Anyone else? Yeah, please. Yeah. So keep it brief, no? That we're beginning to, I guess, the floor.
First of all, thank you so much for this insightful conversation. As an Indian, a very, very question arises in front of me as a student of political science and international relations, that we are having the conversation of European Union and India, where there is a change in how politics is working in Washington and Moscow. So is it getting influenced by more than that, rather than two individual interests of two sovereign states, or may I say union? And secondly, complementary to it, as rightfully people mentioned in the panel, that there is a very lack of people-to-people connect. When we see there is an anti-immigrant protest getting into Europe, so how Europe expects us to be increasing people-to-people contact where there is an anti-immigrant protest across the Europe? So how do you look forward to it?
Just go to the VFS and see the swamping of the European missions. The Indians want to go and roast. I think we had 4 questions, so maybe we'll start Gulshan, then we'll come this way.
Well, thank you. I think we had a very useful discussion, I must say, because one is, you're right. This is what, in fact, my worry is also, that there are very clear focused areas where progress can be made and where there are clear convergences are there. We are talking about FTA, we are talking about investment agreement, we are talking about certain thing in connectivity, we are also talking about certain things working in third countries, in the global south together, in triangular cooperation projects and many, many other things. And this has been already identified over the years. So certain things can be made. But the problem again is that if the whole thing is kind of hijacked by something else, in this case Russia and the Ukraine war, and then we get lost our energies into the area in which, you can see from this discussion as well that there are obviously very different perceptions in India. There is history, there are, so that's why we need much more understanding of the European positions and also much more understanding of the Indian positions, why they are. And those kind of conversations would perhaps lead to, certain kind of, I would say appreciation of what the other partner is thinking. And, on Russia, if I just take a minute. Okay. No, this way. Yeah. No, I was coming to that also. The other things which were discussed on SDGs and others, I think there are plenty of plenty of action plans already there. So we are working with the European Union and also with the member states, also in the renewables. And these are the areas in which a lot of things are happening, and also in the migration and mobility. Now, on the Russia particularly, one is about, you mentioned about, oil. Now, interestingly for India, oil purchases from Russia has become a litmus test for its strategic autonomy, both in the case of particularly with the United States and also now becoming more perhaps from the European Union. So now how India is going to react to this? Either will give it, so far it hasn't, and in fact to my understanding, I follow very closely all the numbers, etc. India's purchase of Russian oil is not going to go down. It's going to go up. There are many ways. And Indian understanding is that we are not violating anything. In fact, India is buying so far whatever.
There are things government says and the things governments do. So it's a question of what she was saying was, look, if there is sufficient pressure, maybe, because the numbers will come in 2 months, whether those numbers will change, we don't know at this point. Today's position is, the government has never said, I will always buy from Russia. But they've only said, our companies...
No, I was not talking about the government numbers. I'm talking about the numbers, all the orders, etc.
Those are not political positions. Those were conveniences that were designed to give the government flexibility. So they're buying on spot market, they're deciding what's good for them, which is a convenient way of saying...
Well, no, to me as an analyst, what the government does or doesn't do, that's their job. But what I look at it, if at the end of the day, if government gives in either to the United States or to some other pressure, that also would show what exactly the kind of, strategic autonomy we are talking. And this is what, that will also impact, many other things. One has to look at that point of view, not what the government is saying or trying to,
The government won't give in, the PSUs will.
Yeah, but I think the language, although I use it quite a lot, this language of giving in is a misnomer. We did it with Iran. We zeroed out every drop of Iranian oil that made up 12% of India's oil intake, as you well know. It was sweeter crude, it was cheaper crude, it came from much closer by, it was a more resilient source, and yet India gave it up. We also gave up Venezuelan oil at the same time. So the idea that India's strategic autonomy is defined then was defined in 2017-18. It's not going to be defined today. On the other questions, the questions are refreshing because what it tells us is very simply 2 things. One, we do not, as I said, we do not speak the same language on values. We have differences. We need to recognize those. We need to understand those and therefore make our expectations of each other a little lower or a little different from the obvious, the hurt in the room is clearly a symbol of disappointment. And yet the truth is expectations will have to be somewhere close to reality if you don't want to be disappointed. So that's the first. The second is let the realists come in and talk about what is important to the relationship, whether it's economy, whether it's strategy, whether it's technology. And I think, there is such realism in the room. When you talk about how mobility agreements have now become the thing, they've become the norm in our relationship with Europe, when every one of us can remember, the years and years of the government pushing for visas and Indians thinking that they will get citizenship. Everything was a path to citizenship. And that should be a given. Today, the relationship with Europe is heading in the direction that India already has had with the Gulf for decades, which is that as long as there is work, as long as there are contracts to be filled, as long as there are remittances to be sent home, and that actually suits India as well. The fact is that we will get those. But when it comes to a path to citizenship, of being able to move there and moving our families along with us over there, and then, having the cultural conflicts that are so obvious on the streets of whether it's Dublin or Melbourne or Texas and Canada, we're probably not going to see as much of that. I think Indians have to realize that. And look, when it comes to this idea of Europe being just able to get on with Russia and somehow find bring them into a strategic structure, because that's all that they want. The truth is, yes, if that is realistic, then it should be equally realistic for Indians to relook at the way we project ourselves. The idea that we project this relationship with Pakistan as a non-negotiable, even if it is in South Asia's interest, even if it is in the regional interest to find ways to do business inside here, find jobs here, find trade here. We don't do it. So the truth is that a lot of very frank conversations end up maybe exposing our own hypocrisies as much.
Thank you very much. Let me say AI and India and Europe would be a great thing. One could sit together and, with our academic, knowledge and experience, I think that would be a great area of common cooperation. But Anirudh's question, I think, is the one which made me think the most. I think our relations, Europe-India relations are very differentiated, and it is very difficult to nail it down to one point, unlike China 20 years ago. And I think you are completely right. Our discussion with China would have been business, 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 industry, industry, nothing but that. But with India, we are on a completely different level. So it's very difficult to say, is there one thing that is the biggest priority for India and Europe? No, I think there is not such a thing. But one thing comes to mind where India and Europe could work together in a way that could change many things. And that's how business and sustainability can go together. So when it comes to renewables, when it comes to trying to discover, how to reduce carbon emissions, you see I keep telling people that one thing that, India and Europe have in common is that most of the best things happened outside the government, and not inside the government. So when you see the top-notch Indian private sector when it comes to renewables, let's say, and joining hands with Europe, and I think India being one of the main sources of emissions right now, I mean, if that goes in a good direction, we can really change the world. And that's not so possible with many, many other countries, including, I have to say, the US of America, where now the president says it's all a hoax, and this is something where India and Europe can be very, very good. And my last remark, because I can't leave this room without mentioning Russia another time, we learned it the hard way. And this is my advice to the Indian side in all honesty but also modesty. You have to be careful to get too dependent on one energy provider. Germany got its gas more than 50% from Russia. We learned it the hard way from one day to the other. So it is, and there are still some European countries who didn't manage to get out of this trap, if I may say so. So it is wise in a sort of geopolitical approach to distribute your energy provision or providers in a large number.
Thank you. I think that we had a wonderful discussion. I don't think we agreed on much, but I think the very fact that we're having this discussion, I think one of the tragedies in the current debate on Ukraine and India, I mean, really, we've had very little public debate on the issues. One reason is that the political class simply, closed itself. Now, if you go back to 1956, when Russia, Soviet Union invaded Hungary, and in 1968, when it invaded Czechoslovakia, and 1979, when it invaded and occupied Afghanistan, there was a vigorous debate in India, in Delhi. The one party which historically opposed blind support to Russia was the Jan Sangh, which is the precursor of the current BJP. In fact, the BJP, the Jan Sangh at the time said Indira Gandhi was too pro-Soviet. But I think what's happened is since then, BJP seems to love the same ideas as well, which is really Russia is our best friend, therefore we're going to zip our mouth. Now, that's the reality. Now, that reality will change when the pressure from the Americans mounts, or when your other interests begin to bear on the question, and whether for you, unlike in the 50s, 60s, 70s, you're not as dependent on Russia today, on Security Council veto, or a whole lot of other things. Therefore, how we calculate will change under circumstances. So I think that's the first thing to remember, that nothing is set in stone. It depends on how India calculates its interests at a given point of time. And I think that will depend in turn on the circumstances. And the reality is, India's interests in Europe and America have grown dramatically, notwithstanding all the other problems, that our biggest trading partners are today US and Europe. So how we manage the Russia question is not a trivial question. It's an important one, and I think that's where the policy will play out. Second, I think, is the question of values versus interests we talk about. But circumstances again generate answers. I mean, at one point we were saying there's no such thing as a good Taliban, right? Our media loved that line. But today we're actually talking to the Taliban. Or, for example, India was very hesitant to support Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iraq. When Saddam got defeated, circumstances have changed. You deal with the realities on the ground. That means you deal with what American invasion produced in Iraq. So I think it's not some kind of a what is the Moses code or something that like circumstances change, governments will change because policies will change depending on the circumstance. And finally, I think there is a battle of principle versus principle. I think we've often ignored it in our debate. For example, a lot of Indians believe NATO in Ukraine threatens Russia. Therefore, when Putin says NATO should not be there, Ukraine should be neutral, or Central Europe should be neutral, he's asserting Russian interests. Now, do we have to accept the proposition that Ukraine has no rights? That Lithuania has no rights to choose its security choices? Right? Just as you say, Russia has its interests to be kept. Ukraine as a nation, Baltics as a nation, they feel they will choose, because they don't like Russians. No, whether you like it or not, they have a history, a memory of Russia, which is imperial. They don't want to be part of the Russian sphere, just as Pakistan doesn't want to be part of the Indian sphere, though we cook the same food and we sing the same stupid songs. So there is a single Orthodox church which binds the Russians and the Ukrainians, a common history, but Ukraine does not want to be part of Russia. But that's a reality. So there are two principles here. There's not just one principle of NATO expansion. There's also the principle, how does Ukraine secure its sovereignty in the face of a Russian problem they have? So I think where this leads us is really, one thing is the public debate, of course, but I think one of the points of doing this issue, I think our strategic community must begin to look deeper at the European geopolitics, European history, and their intersect problems within Europe. And I think, Suhasini said, look, we never looked Europe through Russia, but I think because we had no economic engagement with Western Europe, because we dismissed all of them as pro-American, and Russia was a best friend, we didn't do enough engagement with Western Europe. But still, we didn't do enough with the Eastern Europe that was part of the Warsaw Pact arrangements. We had special access, India had special access to Warsaw Pact countries. Yet, our understanding of why the Poles hate the Russians, or why the Czechs have a view of Russia, we never really bothered to study those things. Because for us, Russian side was good, American side was bad. But I think today, Europe is a more complicated place, and I think is entering even a more complex phase. So I would strongly urge, one, for the Indians strategic community to sit down and work more intensely to understand this. And my appeal to all the European ambassadors is to support the efforts, I think, to get a better appreciation. I think for Indians need better appreciation of European history, European geopolitics. There was a time when European history used to be taught in the colleges. That's all gone now. Even in the IAS exams, you could do European history as a subject. But today, we don't do enough of that, and I think we need more knowledge of Europe, not just doing tourism in Europe, but I think that's where the scholarly community has a huge task, and we look forward to support from our EU friends to really build up that capability within India. So thank you all for joining us this morning, and before we go, Junjun, are you making the vote of thanks and about the lunch?
No.
No, I really wanted to thank you, Professor Mohan, because I think you made such an important point that because we were somehow, I felt, losing a bit the plot here in the course of the conversation. I think if we really want to address the significance of what we call a strategic partnership, we cannot be mirrored in areas of divergence and other starting to pick up, because otherwise what we are doing is simply short-term strategic hedging and basically transactionalism. And I think there is a risk, I sense, that we simply take it, because it's a fluid environment, we can choose and pick and choose and go around, shop around. You know, EU also has its options. We just concluded an FTA with Indonesia. We have several lineups. So the world is a place. I think the message that really has to own here, and by the proposal that the EU is doing together with the member states, is really a vote of confidence on building something with India. And I think this is what we need to, for that matter, the word cultivate, I think is really appropriate, in both strategic spheres, to have deeper understanding of the calculus, of how we adjust our own equations. And the same, I would say, in Europe, there is a lack of understanding of India, this feel of being surrounded in its strategic area between, two borders on the north, an open ocean, a region, as you rightly said, that India somehow wants to ignore sometimes its close neighborhood because it's too turbulent, it's too difficult. I think this is also to be cultivated in Europe. So I really take your point that I think it's so important, and that's the reason why we are several to really militate to have this fifth pillar in the joint communication about think tank community. And this will be not just talk. We will mobilize funding for this kind of possibilities and bring the two strategic communities and think tank to work together. Thank you.